So, Cesar, welcome to Intersection Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah,
and,
thank you.
We've been looking forward to this conversation with you and touch on different topics as we discuss offline. So the way we do it, I will let you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you, where you come from, what you do, where you are, and we take it from there, and we let the conversation, flow.
Sounds good.
So
Sounds
go ahead.
good.
So it's your
Yeah.
show.
So my name is Ruiz. I currently live in New Jersey, right outside of the big city. I was born in Puerto Rico. I have a father that was born in Brazil, of all places, and went as a 15-year-old to Puerto Rico and spent his pretty much his life there. He considers himself Puerto Rican. My mother is 100% Puerto Rican. He met her there. I would say that I grew up more Puerto Rican than anything else. I didn't discover my Brazilian roots until I got into the world of sports, where I finally started to follow soccer and became a huge fan of the sport. And it's probably one of the sports that I watch the most now outside of the NBA. So it's pretty ironic how the world, sort of flipped for me a bit. And for the last, I would say the last 2.5 or almost 3 years now, actually, I've spent some time working at Microsoft. I lead the advertising division there on the East Coast. It's a pretty large business, considering where I come from. I come from traditional media, where I spent previous 4 years working at BeIN Sports, and before that at ESPN International and ESPN Deportes in the U.S. And so that was, to me, what I would consider traditional media. I'm in the intersection of technology and sort of advertising now, and it's been interesting for the last couple of years to really see that sort of play out, and the lens by which I look at advertising now is so much different than the way that I looked at it before. So, it's an honor for me to join you all and have a discussion around that, because I feel like there's just a lot to unpack in the way that we think about it now. And, I know you all have some really great perspective about how you think about it, particularly in the world of sports, but even just in the world of brand and media. So, I'm looking forward to getting into a good discussion.
Awesome. Excited.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, thanks for being Cesar. I mean, I'd be remiss if I don't give shout out to Lawrence Roman, who was the guy who connected us, like probably a decade ago.
Over 10 years. Yeah.
Shout out to Roman, to Lawrence from La Romana, actually, the La Romana crew. So
Roman from La Romana.
From La Romana, yeah. Interesting guy. I think we need to have him on board as well. Actually, you come from, as you say, from traditional media, which within media, sports is kind of a separate island, I would say, from the outside. So take us a bit through on how you land on ESPN Deportes, and how you start with media. I mean, was it something that was straight out of college, or how that came to be?
Yeah, I think my path, again, having an unusual upbringing. I was raised in New Jersey, and I was raised by my mother. My father decided that he would never ever leave this country of Puerto Rico. So my mother brought us here when I was 3 years old, and I've spent my entire childhood here. So I would say that I was raised. What sort of drove me and created, who I am today was sports, right? And that sort of was this thing that I followed. All through, growing up, I played baseball, football, and basketball. I ended up playing baseball in college. And so when I was going through college, I wasn't thinking about my career and sort of what I was going to do. I know that there's, when I talk to young men and women now, I'm 47, so I'm a little bit older, but I think about the way that they look at, their future is very short-sighted, right? It's almost like, well, for the first 4 years, I want to do this, and then maybe I'll go do that. I wasn't thinking like that. I didn't know what I was going to do. I figured whatever path it would lead me is the path that I would go. And so my junior year in college, actually coming off my sophomore year, I played baseball at Seton Hall University, which was a pretty good university. I mean, if you have some recollection there, Mo Vaughn was the first baseman right when I was being recruited. He was the first baseman there. Craig Biggio is a Hall of Famer, played at Seton Hall. So really good baseball program. So I had a good chance to play with some really great talent. And as I was going through my sophomore year, where I thought I would finally get some playing time, that summer, you know, we played quite a bit, and I got tendonitis in my shoulder, and that became really the beginning of the end for me, and thinking that I had a career in baseball. And so I ended up playing through that year with some injuries. You know, my 88 mile an hour fastball became an 85 mile an hour changeup, and that obviously changed things for me, you know, across the board. And so I started to look at, okay, so what's my future look like? And then, you know, I was always a pretty good student. So I had an opportunity to, at the time I was pursuing political science. Irony, right? Considering these times, I was pursuing political science, and I was going to a meeting with my counselor at one point, and I saw a sign at the door that said there was an internship opportunities to work for several government agencies. And I was like, well, I thought that would be an interesting thing to pursue. So I went in, I said, hey, what's this thing about this government thing? And he's like, yeah, you know, it's a program that we do. It's only a couple of universities are involved. You have to have a 3.7 GPA or higher, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, all right, well, how do I get involved here? And so I applied for the program, and ironic, out of chance, I got selected. I was one of like 20 students through the state of New Jersey that was selected to this program. And lo and behold, I had no idea what I was going for, but it was for the U.S. Customs, which is Homeland Security today. U.S. Customs was one of the programs that was involved, and so they reached out. They said, "Hey, we're interested in your background. We'll make you a contingency offer." At the time, but they had to do an extensive background. Right. So it's like any government job, right? You have to go through this crazy background. So I'm like, okay, fine. I mean, I haven't killed anyone, shot anyone, never been in jail, but okay. But then they start and they actually do an extensive background. And I don't know how deep you want me to get, but they did this extensive background on me, and they went to ask my teachers about me, my coaches, my neighbors, people who I didn't even put them on the application, but they went and started asking questions about me. So I guess it wasn't so bad that I was able to get through the process. I got hired on, and I was what they would consider a customs officer. And it was like while I was in school, it was my junior and senior year of college. So I worked from 1 to 9 p.m. and I worked in the airport. So my whole life between junior and senior year was working at the airport, basically checking people's bags. So if you ever came from the Dominican Republic or Germany and you're getting to Newark and there's someone stopping you and says, what's the purpose of your trip? You know, look, let me see your declaration. Are you carrying over $10,000? Are you carrying anything that you're supposed to carry? So that was me. I was one of those people, except I didn't have approval to carry a gun yet. So it was pretty, it was like 4 of us spread across the airport, different shifts. And then we would, I guess the most interesting thing about that job was, because I spoke Spanish, everybody else, for the most part, was English speaking. I was asked to do the Colombia flights at JFK. So they would fly us in a helicopter from Newark some nights. I think it was Wednesdays and Thursday nights. I forget. It was 2 nights because at the time Newark didn't have any flights from Colombia. And if you think back to 1993, 94, that was when Colombia was at the height of the drug exchange. So we would go out to JFK Airport, and I would do all the searches because we were going to do a full sweep of the plane. So every single person coming off of that plane was going to be searched and interrogated, and that was something that we did. So again, that was probably the funnest thing that I did in that job. But when it was over and they were going to make me a full-time offer when I graduated college, I was like, this sucks. I don't want to be a glorified officer. This is not what I went to school for. So literally from one day to the next, I quit. I was like, I don't want to do this. And people are like, are you crazy? That's a government job, 20 years, you retire, blah, 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 all this stuff. So I did it. I said, no, I don't want to do that. My guidance counselor had always told me, you can come back and be a teacher. I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. I'll be a teacher. So I went back to my school, got my certification to teach. I started teaching as a substitute. And then one of my old English teachers who taught ESL became really ill, and he was out for an extended period. So they asked me to step in as an extended substitute. So now I'm like grading lessons and doing like the whole thing as a substitute. And then at the end of that year, I realized this sucks, right? So now I'm like, okay, so now what's next?
You're being a cop for kids now, so yeah.
Exactly. So I'm like, okay, now what? So then, at the time, again, this is when the market was starting to boom and things are starting to really pick up in the U.S. So a lot of my friends that didn't go the law enforcement route went the Wall Street route. So I'm like talking to my friends and I'm like, all right, well, how did you get in there? How did you get into Merrill Lynch? How did you get into Smith Barney? How did you do all these, Goldman Sachs? They were like, just, I don't know, just apply and see how it works. And I was able to get an interview with Solomon Smith Barney at the time. This was in 1997, I guess. And I don't know how I was able to sell myself through for a job as a what they call a portfolio administrator. And I worked my way up. I was basically managing institutional sales like mutual funds. So I was like the support group basically for that, and worked my way up. I mean, up to 2001, 9/11. I worked in the World Trade Center. I was in the towers when 9/11 happened, and I was working for Smith Barney as a regional vice president. My team was a group of wholesalers, so I had worked my way up pretty quickly into that world. And when 9/11 happened, that's when everything sort of flipped upside down for me. And they relocated our company to Connecticut. I still lived in New Jersey. So I was commuting an hour and a half each way. And if you've ever driven up 95 when it's snowing, not a pleasant experience. So again, that brought me to my next influx of where I'm like, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. So now what's next? So I go into I speak to a couple friends and I'm like, what's out there, and they're like, well, this whole thing called digital media, digital is like starting to boom. And so I was like, all right, cool. So I'll go to NYU. NYU had these certificate courses, and I took an NYU course in digital marketing. Very basic at the time. This was, I guess, 2003, maybe 2002. So I took this course. I met this guy, Julian, who was the general manager for the Tribune at the time, the Tribune Publishing. And we became really friendly. He became like my mentor and my godfather in this industry. And he's like, I think you have what it takes. You just have to sell yourself as more of a seller and a leader than anything else. And I think you could make that transition. So I'm like, all right, let's do it. Put me in touch with somebody. So I would say about 6 months later, I was running business development for the Tribune in Long Island for a short time. And that was really my entry into media. And it was in print media, right? So I know it's a long circle to get there, but that's where I started. I started in newspaper print back in 2003 and sort of worked my way through a couple of different organizations. And I'll sort of take you to, fast forward a little bit to get to the question you asked, which is one of the companies I worked for was Televisa Publishing. And so I had the opportunity to work with Televisa, both in the US and in Mexico City. And, I was doing licensing for them. So I was managing their licensing deals with their publishers, publishing magazines like Vanidades and Cosmopolitan and some of those magazines. But also, I was also in charge of like some of their products like Condorito and I think it was Chavo and those shows that you may have grown up with in the island. So I was licensing those here in the U.S., like working with either retailers or publishers or some of those, like Hearst was one of my big partners, Rodeo Publishing, and then ESPN. I was asked to approach them to consider doing a magazine in Espanol. And so that's what I did. I connected with Lino Garcia, who was their GM at the time. And we built a good relationship, and he was on board with doing the magazine. So I was able to secure that deal. And about a year later, after locking that deal, he calls me and said, hey, we're opening up a position for a director of sales for the US and Mexico at the time, for managing, the TV sales team, radio, all that stuff. And I'm like, well, I've never done TV. he's like, I'm sure you can figure it out, right? And that was back, I guess that was 2007. So I got the job at ESPN. That started my career in sports. That started my career in TV. I got out of the print industry, which was good because that was a dying industry anyway. And sort of, spent eight and a half good years at ESPN working in a couple of different areas there. But again, the one thing that's common here is that I was never an actual seller, right? I never had to be on the street selling. I was really taking on the skills that I learned as a leader, and those skills as a leader I didn't learn in the workforce. I learned them on the field, right? I learned them, as a captain of my baseball team in high school, as a sophomore, as a captain of the football team, right? And so I learned those skills, and I didn't really make that connection until much later in my life. And I'm like, well, how did I just become a leader? How did I get into a role where I was, moved into several different positions, leading 40, 50, 60, 80 people? And it was really that. And, so I spent good time there. Always looked at ESPN as the pinnacle, right? Like I had reached it. I mean, there was no reason for me to ever leave there. I saw myself retiring. I saw my boss going to my retirement party. And then things started to change a little bit where, the market wasn't as great. I felt that I was starting to hit a snag, which was the first time in my career that I felt that that movement wasn't moving as fast as I would have wanted to. And there were several options for me to explore at the time, but BeIN Sports, if you're familiar with them, they were doing some interesting things and acquiring certain rights in outside of the U.S. And when they came into the U.S. in 2000, I guess that was 2013, 12, somewhere in that range, they started reaching out to me to potentially come over and run their operations, basically their entire commercial operations. And I did that. The first two times that they approached me, I went through the interview process and I turned them down. And then one time I think I had a fight with my boss. I was, feeling pissed off. They happened to call again. The timing was right. They made me the right offer and I left. And that was like the bold move, right? Because I was already, a couple of kids in. I needed some stability, making sure that ESPN was taking care of me. I had some, stock options and I had a pension, and I left all of that to try something that was really more entrepreneurial in nature. And it wasn't, it was something that I would say was a really great experience for me because, again, going back to the leadership route, but it taught me so much about the market and the industry and the way to look at it. And so I'm really blessed to have had that opportunity. To do that in the world of sports. And then, but as it started to get closer to the end, I started to see that the business they weren't really supporting the business in the US in the right way. And I felt that it was a means to an end. I think they were really coming to a place where they were going to start hitting a lot of walls. And so I started, pitching myself outside of sports. And I thought that a good opportunity was to connect sports with technology. And to me, that was like really the next wave. So I approached certain companies, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft really were the three that I was really pursuing at the time. And I had an opportunity to go work at Microsoft. I met somebody on a panel that I was on, and we connected, hit it off, had a process, I went through it, and I ended up landing a job with Microsoft, not necessarily in the sports side, but in the technology specifically, but it was advertising, right? So I was able to leverage my advertising experience, bring in this whole world of AI and this world that I was not accustomed to at all. But it's been great, and I've been here, like I said, 3 years, and it's just been a long road. But hopefully that gave you a good perspective of the sort of the wave. I know that was a little long-winded, but I think it gives you some perspective as to where I come from, why I'm here, and then sort of how I look at the world now from where I sit.
No, and to your point, I mean, usually when we look at what's next in our careers, we have, I think it's a very human sensation of needing control of what will happen next. But usually the very successful guys that I know, like you and many others, that you don't have linear paths. I mean,
right.
Neither myself, or Ruiz, or Vedran. I mean, you
right.
actually need to be able to
you want to control.
Yeah, correct. And that's the idea. The thing is to understand how you perform in certain under certain circumstances, which
Yeah.
depend, regardless of where the environment you will be placed in, it will
Right.
play out the same way. You need to be a leader. You need to be a very
Yeah.
good team manager. You need to be a very good strategist and so on. Right?
Yeah.
So that's I think the first part is that as a learning to anyone who will be listening to this, and then in the first question that that popped now and towards the end of your explanation was, usually in sports, the sales part in terms of brand advertising or partnerships or whatever it is very much anchored on the property.
Yes.
So in the case of ESPN, you had very successful shows on TV and very good verticals elsewhere, and you have very good rights for major sports competitions, right? So that's kind of the anchor of the sales pitch. I mean, you are going to be there because there is your potential audience.
Yeah.
How much is different, if it is, towards the way you approach advertising from this platform that you are selling advertising from?
How do I approach it differently?
Yeah.
I honestly don't know that I do. I think it's you're still trying to solve problems, right? In my mind, when I'm speaking to a CMO in my world now, and I was speaking to a CMO 5 years ago, the conversation was always around what are the problems that you need to solve for, and how can I help you do that, right? And so I think it's in the context of that, I always figured out how to make that be the sort of the guiding principle, or what I call the North Star. So it didn't deviate much, right? I mean, it wasn't because I knew the NFL or because I knew La Liga or Champions League. It was because I understood that if you're Samsung and you're looking to understand how to better leverage and connect your product by leveraging my brand, then it's my job to help you sort of bring those two together. So it really, I never took the lens, and that's why I realized when because leaving sports was hard for me, right? I love it. I grew up with it. But when I did some self-reflection, what I realized is that it wasn't so much the sport. It was what really drove me, and what I got energy from was the having that meeting. And I know you do, right? Because it's you live on this thing, is to go secure that meeting. And then in that meeting to be able to turn the tide, right? Where someone's telling you, yeah, I don't need your product. And then through that discussion, that you can walk out of there and saying, okay, so when are we meeting next, right? And that's really what drives me. So it was, sports was easy because, you were speaking a common language. But even now, I don't know a lot of our products. I don't know people. I go into a meeting. I just had a meeting with Samsung, just a couple, and that's why I bring them up. And they're asking, one of the things that they wanted is like, hey, we want a global partner. It's going to be you, Facebook, or Google. We're like, okay, great. But we want a global partner who's going to bring in all these elements in there. But we want LinkedIn, we want Xbox, we want all these assets. And we're like, oh crap, right? Because that's the one thing that, while you might think is an easy thing to do, it's not, right? Because now I'm pulling my partners at LinkedIn, I'm pulling my partners at Xbox, and they all have their own agendas. And, to the Azure team, right? Thinking about what Samsung what is in relation to all of the others. Are they important to the Azure team? Maybe not, right? And so it's a little bit of that. So that's the uniqueness of this role. So those are the things that I'm not an expert in it, but I think the conversation is still the same. I need to solve a problem for this CMO. It was the SVP, but it's a different problem that I need to solve for, and it doesn't necessarily involve sports. It's still solution solving.
Exactly. It's finding the solutions. I mean, I use, now that I get older, I mean, I'm a bit younger, but that I get older, I get, asked a lot to come back to my college class or whatever to speak to the new generation. I mean, outside of the typical question that I ask, why are you coming into sports management or whatever? And everyone, wants to close the next big Nike deal for Cristiano Ronaldo.
Yeah.
The examples that I put there is that one, the glamour that you see in the industry, when you are a real worker of it, you don't get to experience it,
No.
or at least not that much as you might think. But the reality is that from my perspective, when I come from the finance, economics, finance, banking and finance, and being an auditor or an advisor in big four firms, is that I apply that toolkit, which I swore by that I will never, ever, ever will read, a financial report again, because that was, the most boring thing ever. But I found myself reading a lot of those throughout the days in order for me to, previous to that meeting with the CMO, identifying which are the pressure points that they have, the problems that they need to fix through sponsorship or whatever partnership I'm working in, right?
Yeah.
So and that's the thing. I mean, and if you ask me, and Luis knows this because I told him many times, me out of college, I define myself as an introvert, which is contradictory to what we're doing here.
To what we do. I'm the same.
But and for me, the notion of selling something came with that feeling that I'm trying to dupe someone into believing in me. So that terrifies me. So I always landed to the facts, to understanding your business as a partner and how I can help you. And in many cases, and actually that has happened in my career, we actually sometimes said, you know what, I'm not able to help you because what you're trying to solve is, I'm not. So thanks, probably down the road we'll find an opportunity to do that. And those are actually the most close relationships that I built because we're based on honesty and not trying to dupe someone,
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a great point.
So, and now that you are touching on your current life as an outsider from sports media, and you actually you in the timeline that you described, you actually went through all the major, let's say, valleys that the industry has had. You saw the .com burst, how all of a sudden media rights went crazy high, and how people still think that one single media stream might solve things for a media outlet.
Yeah.
You pick any publication these days and you see even ESPN, laying off people, left and right, or unfilling positions that they thought that they might need. So what do you think is the cause for those symptoms that we see right now in the media landscape?
The cause for that, I think it's the fact that you're trying to top or compete, right? Because now you think about the world. I mean, ESPN, when it was, when I started back into it, it was 2008. It was very simple, right? We didn't compete with NBC Sports. We weren't competing with the Fugals of the world. We weren't competing with all these the Zone, right? We weren't competing with all of these sports platforms that exist today. So it becomes this thing where you have to continuously, right? Now you're overpaying for rights. Now, in order to support those rights, now you have to sell a certain amount because there's CFOs in the back that are saying, okay, I'm going to pay $2 billion for these rights, but here's how much revenue you need to bring in, right? And so there's this competition of, you're going to need to build a strong sales force or a marketing force and all this stuff to go out and do that. But then what happens is when you get into this sort of, you come to a point of inflection where, gosh, like, especially now, I mean, we're at a standstill, right? I mean, sports are canceled. The Olympics were canceled for NBC. I mean, what happens to all that money? What happens to all those impressions that the brands were looking to, right? So it's all of that. And as the economy, it was I would say in a pretty good state prior to COVID. And so I think what's really driving it is that it's the sense for, you continue to reach for these I was so aspirational sort of goals, right? That ESPN for years has been going after Sunday Night Football. So that's something that it's even going to be more expensive than their NBA rights, right? And so, how do you pay for that? Right? I mean, it's not because you have two things that are happening. People are cord cutting, right? So you have that happening on one side. Then you have the other side that the rights are just so expensive. People aren't and people aren't consuming. So how do you hit those metrics, right? If I don't have cable and I'm not paying that crazy subscriber fee to ESPN and Disney, then how are they able to turn around and on that get their ROI on that investment, right? And so I think that's really what's happening, and it's just their opportunity cost was probably not valued in the same way, right? I mean, they weren't expecting something like this. I think they were also leaning quite a bit on the brand, right? So Disney as a whole was driving a lot of the sort of, as a parent company, we're supporting it. So and I speak specifically about ESPN, but I think it's the same across the board for NBC, for BeIN Sports, for all these companies that, you know, are paying the astronomical fees for rights. You know, whereas other producers are coming out and just creating content that's being, you know, user generated, right? And so that doesn't cost anything, right? And so you're trying to look at, right before I left ESPN, I remember they were building out the brand new studio for SportsCenter, right? And they spent millions and millions and millions of dollars in doing this. And I'm like, and I was asking myself, I'm like, why are they doing this? Like, especially now, like it's not so much, it's not the studio, it's the content. Like, I think they lost sight of what made them really good. And I think it's caused a lot of issues internally. And that was a huge mistake. They thought that was going to be a game changer, and it wasn't. I think it set them back more than it needed to. And I think it's happening to a lot of companies because they're just competing with each other.
I actually had one thing running around my head because if you read the news in the past couple of weeks, you see that actually also properties are struggling to figure out, you know, new revenue streams and so on, given the whole COVID situation, the fact that, you know, franchises can have people attend the stadiums and things like this. And now we're recording this when the NBA just announced that they're about to start on December. But it's still up in the air on if they're gonna have people attend the games, right? And we know that they're, you know, sending out surveys and things like that to try to understand what's gonna happen. Also, at this particular moment, a new president has been elected in the United States, so changes will happen. So, how all these things affect the way that platforms or you guys, when you're trying to, you know, I don't want to say forecast, but let's say plan your selling in that landscape. How does that affect? How do you approach that?
You know, I would say, fortunately for me, I'm in what I would call the search industry is what I work in, right? So it's, you know, call it, it's one where, despite what's going on, people are always searching, right? People are online a lot more. They're spending more time on their computers, so they're buying more online. So it's our job to ensure that we're helping the brands, you know, connect to you. If you're looking to buy the next, you know, LeBron jersey, you know, and you're looking to buy it, you can buy it at Nike.com, or you could buy it on the Cleveland Cavaliers site. So it's our job to ensure that we get the brands there front and center for those consumers to see it. So I think it's, in our world, it might be a little bit different, but I can tell you that as I reflect back, I'm like, man, if I was still working at BeIN Sports or at ESPN, and the challenge to get in front of a brand today and create a connection and saying, hey, there's value for you in investing in, you know, the NBA season next year. I mean, if most of your budget is going to on-site and field activation, which, Rayde, you know very well, man, like, how do you sell that through, right? And if you're not pivoting and reinventing yourself in this environment, then what are you? And so for me, you know, just to kind of take a step back to address your question in the way that we look at it, is that we have to almost change the way that we look at our relationships with our clients and our consumers and our brands, right? Like, think about the relationships we have that are friendships, right? We look at those and we look at them based on value and, how people sort of carry themselves, what they're about. And I don't think relationships with brands should be any different, right? We started to think about the way that we approach our partners and our customers is by thinking about advertising or connecting with a purpose, right? What is the purpose that you have as a brand, and how do we help you connect there? Because if there's not, I mean, you started to talk about what's changing, but there's this factor now that there's so many people that distrust brands, right? Like it's gotten to a point where because if you think about society, there's so many different components that are out there, and so people are looking at brands differently, right? So if you don't have a purpose that you're really pursuing, you could be Nike, but if you don't have a purpose, right? Like that's why, the Kaepernick thing was such a big thing, because there was a purpose behind it. So people can get behind that. But if you're not, and you also have to be authentic in the way that you do that, right? So there's just so many different variables there that go into play that I think it's important for us as publishers to be thinking about the way that we're going to connect with those brands and how we're going to connect them with their consumers is very different now. And I think we're at the center of that. And I'm excited by that, because I feel like it's a conversation that we've always needed to sort of move along. And I think it's being forced, right? It's like, it's been a forcing function. And I think the ones that are starting to get it are getting ahead of that. The ones that are not are going to stay behind. P&G is a great example here in the U.S. They've figured out how to market from more of I call it inclusive marketing standpoint, right? That they've been able to think about, not just people want to be feel inclusive. They don't just want to be included, right? They want to feel like they're part of it. So there's just a different thing. And I feel like we need to, as publishers, we need to think about that in a different way now.
Yeah. I mean, the brands now are forced to really take a stand, and at the same time, we as consumers are the ones driving that.
We control the purse. Yeah, we control the purse strings for sure.
Cesar, I have two questions. Maybe one a bit bigger, since you are in the search and the things, and I do on a day-to-day basis a lot around search. Could you talk a little bit about what you think is the future of search? In which direction are we going? Because I think it's been a couple of years now that it's just status quo. Let's put it that way. And you talked about how you guys at Microsoft are trying to connect it with LinkedIn and try to do these new things. So could you maybe just give like a few things, and then I can ask you the second question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, what when I came into search, it was traditional. I'm like, okay, so I need to learn about keywords, right? And that was the basis for what search was, and now it's growing to where it's audiences, right? And it's really moving in that direction. And then you have voice search, and you have all of these other components that play a role in the way that people consume. And then is that considered when you ask Alexa, hey, put this in my Amazon cart, is that search, right? Like, what does that look like? And so I think the future of search in general is going to be, how you are going to position yourselves with that consumer and creating that audience in the right way. It's not the traditional search, at least that way I looked at it prior to coming to Microsoft. It's just very different. And like I said, I think it's important for us as a publisher to think about the way that we're connecting with the audiences, right? And the way that we're because there's this whole thing around data that, and that could be a whole different discussion, right? I mean, the cookieless world and everything that's happening in the future now. And so data becomes sort of the way that we build trust, right? And it's like, so for you as a consumer is like, well, what are you willing to give up, right, to get the content you want? And then what are we, right? And so there's like this give and take between, publisher and consumer. And to me, that's the search, right? Like it's like the publishers that are going to be able to garner and create a component of like that. Yes, we want to own that first party data, but we still want to be able to provide the right level of content to our consumers. It becomes a very unique situation for everybody.
It's quite funny that you mentioned data and owning data, because I was reading an article a few months back about an idea related to blockchain with these microtransactions of actually giving a lot of that power back to the user, and user then being able to give that data, which they want to get charged for. And to me, this is part of like where it could go. I'm not sure that it's going to be that easy, and blockchain is is a thing of its own. But it is such a interesting field, especially it's a cookieless world. When we get rid of third-party cookies, how do we deliver customized content to consumers? And to me, this is the part that I feel a lot of brands are not ready for. I think a lot of brands are still in that process of figuring out what is the CPC that they want to actually optimize, and not even thinking about what might happen in the next few years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been on a couple panels over the last couple of weeks, some with some people in the UK, because I feel like the UK is a little bit more ahead of this, you know, because of GDPR and everything that's happened in the UK. It's been interesting to hear perspectives from outside of the US in this terms. But yeah, I mean, again, it just becomes something, you know, I wasn't talking about cookieless worlds, you know, 4 years ago, right? And so it becomes, it's a very interesting dynamic, I can tell you.
No, definitely. And now to geek out a little bit more. No, because I this is the type of conversation also that with Cesar and so on when we met that since ages ago in New York, is the type of conversations that you tend to move to, that tend to move you to thinking ahead, right? So everything hinges on understanding consumers' life journeys, and to be able to place the appropriate engagement opportunities across that daily life of our consumers. A couple of years ago, I think we spoke about it. Kleiner Perkins, this macro, fund and insights house out of Silicon Valley, they produced a report that showed that for the first time, Amazon searches surpassed Google searches.
Mm-hmm.
I somewhat, I mean, I haven't seen, I think they haven't published a subsequent report yet, but I have a hunch that within this period now that we're in, confined at home, and actually that has kind of, exploded, like 1,000, because now it's second nature, as it was second nature for people to actually go and, Google anything or Bing anything. Now it's Amazon. Well, the way I see it, and leaning towards the question, is if that is the battleground right now in terms of being able to put yourself in that space, right? Mm-hmm. It's the verticalization of these macro companies that you have the Xbox, the LinkedIn, as V was saying, and any other services. Amazon as well has Alexa and all that, and Google of course have their own. Do you see that as an industry, what we thought of being the most competitive, and that's another part, the regulation of this, but as the most competitive, the way we understood that was that the most diverse companies, and it was the most competitive way of operating. But what it seems now is that for everything to be thriving from a business perspective, integration, it's kind of, or vertical integration is kind of the way forward, because right now it's about the platform, right?
Right.
I don't know if I'm making sense in that.
Yeah. Look, I think I do think that it's an interesting dynamic, right? When you think about the industry and the way that it's moving, I would say that for us and for us to think about the way that we compete aggressively, right? So Google, just to give you perspective, I mean, we're about an $8 billion operation, which is small in terms of what Google brings in, right? Google's probably 80 billion, right? I mean, in terms of their search business. So it's like almost, 10x what we do. And that's about right when you think about the share of wallet. The challenges that they have, and by the way, they just reported earnings, right? So we reported earnings, Microsoft just reported earnings, and we had a strong quarter. Google had about 22% year over year. Facebook, Snapchat, I mean, everyone had. The irony of the fact that we're going through these times and all of these brands are reporting positive year over year earnings. What does that tell us, right? I mean, what is that what is the indicator that this is clicking through? And I find that more and more, to your point, as you start to see the consolidation, yes, Google, YouTube, and all these other things are super important, but it's the concentration in the cloud. It's the concentration in the media and advertising business that's really been driving the growth for some of these companies. So yes, there's verticalization across the organization that's going to be critical, but it's got to be streamlined and it's got to be somehow interconnected for it to be successful. And I find that that's where we've been really good, is to be able to leverage the cloud and leverage Teams and those types of platforms that have been able to, LinkedIn, continues to be, one that perhaps is like a, they operate on their own, right? We don't really control the LinkedIn operation, but just the way that they've been able to enhance what we do in terms of the data, right? Because again, if we're talking to the consumer that we were going after, we're talking about that more affluent, career-oriented, right? That sort of 32 plus, sort of professional. We have all of that data, right? And so again, the one thing that we pride ourselves in is that we have that data, but we use that data smartly and we protect our consumers. We're not going out and selling that data. So I think that's all going to be at the crux of all of this, is like, to your point, is like, that is the battleground, but a person who the brands that are going to win are the ones that are going to be able to do that effectively and do that in the right way that creates trust and builds trust with the consumers.
Sorry, I was muted. There was some yelling here in the background, and of course I'm feeling how I'm feeling. No, we this whole conversation of platforms is something that we've been talking about actually for the past few years, and
Mm-hmm.
the current situation has accelerated the let's say the topic. I actually don't have any more questions on my list.
You want to
We
go?
pretty much cover my side. So V,
Yeah,
you had a second question.
I'll pick your slot, Luis, because actually thinking now and linking it to sports because of different conversations that I'm having here in Europe. I mean, the major clubs or properties, they crave a big brand, a big partner that they can do different things. And everyone now is talking about digital transformation and how data will transform the way you can engage with fans and so on. But the reality is that sports specifically, or entertainment in general, is still giving away money, especially to third-party platforms, because you create the content, you push it on Facebook. Facebook makes the killing. I mean, it's a simple racket, right? Yeah. So the reality is that if the more conversations that I'm having with key stakeholders in the ecosystem, the more convinced that I become in terms that they don't have a way into actually how they will make themselves relevant in this future world that we're seeing. Because in the end, right now, sports was, up until now, a nice add-on, a passion point, if you may, of fans that you could put in an ecosystem of content that in a certain range or in a central moment, it provides that engagement. What everyone thought about the resumption of competition this summer across the globe was that sports was going to kill it, because fans were like crazy. Home. Being home, and they were craving for content because they were not able to go to the stadiums, and all the ratings fell flat. Because we are now in a moment in which we are in content overkill. I mean, we're seeing it. I mean, I think that the ratings that the American election has been getting here in Spain are higher than the ones that the Spanish election got. So, I mean, that's the type of world that we're living in.
It's unbelievable.
It's crazy. It's crazy. So, but that's the thing. Now, and at least from the sports and entertainment side, which is mostly my day-to-day, what I tell, clubs or leagues and so on, is that you need to make a real concerted effort in actually understanding your fan better than what third parties know of them. Because of the conversation that we're talking about the journey. Because we need to recognize that the main product, so the live game, the 2-hour broadcast in basketball or the 4-hour broadcast in baseball, is not as sacred or as valued anymore.
Right.
Fans are not consuming that in that way. So you need to find a way to engage with them in whatever shape, form, and that might be, you talking to fans that are only interested about sneakers and creating content regarding, the sneaker game of the players.
Right.
Not
And that's it.
a five. Yeah, that's it. Because probably don't need 5 seconds of a game action clip to actually be able to do that. And going back to and linking it to a conversation that we had with a good friend of ours, Joseph Barnes of Translation, that actually we were talking on grander terms, but that actually plays through here. You need to stop aiming towards the middle of the bell. You remember that, guys, right? You need to pick a lane and actually try to develop that vertical, because if not, you'll be missing out.
You can't serve everybody.
Yeah, that's the reality.
Yeah.
And I think that's goes back to what we were saying about the sports media landscape. I mean, you are buying rights left and right, and they has the same 24 hours, and the fans have the same purchasing power. So
yeah. I think I think about it from this standpoint, right? I spent many years in the multicultural marketing space, right? Which is, I spent so many years trying to convince brands of the importance of cultural heritage and language, right? And sort of ethnicity and those things that really matter for the multicultural space. And then, and that was an uphill battle. And I would argue that that's still something that still hasn't been really figured out, right? People are still trying to get there. And when I think about my conversations now, it's more centered on I spoke to this a little bit earlier, but are on purpose. But it's more around equating to inclusive marketing and creating that inclusivity where people, like I said, they want inclusion. They don't just want to be included, but it's more than that, right? Like when I think about when I talk to our partners about inclusive marketing, it's really understanding your customers' values, right? Like it's what value drives them. What is that experience that customer is looking for, right? And creating that experience. And I think that when the way we were getting a pass, right? Brands were getting a pass because sports were such a big platform. The NBA, the World Cup, the NFL, all these places, they had such a huge platform where they would, sell a sponsorship and put a logo somewhere and then get somebody to sit outside the stadium and give out a couple things, and that was it. But I think consumers have gotten a little bit more savvy now, and they're like, that's not going to do it for me. I think you need to ensure that what the product that you're building, that it's it sort of has an experience, that it's designed for everyone, right? That it has that inclusive nature to it, and really creating that long lasting value that people are going to connect to. So it's really, if it's true for any marketer, right? Or any industry, any partner, in any country, because if you're not doing that today, then I think you start to start becoming more of the past, right? Because we're going through this manifestation of authenticity and that connection that we need to really bring to the forefront, and it has to feel authentic. It has to match the consumer's values, their needs, their wants, right? And it has to create that sense of connection, and then that leads to the part that we talked about, which is the trust, right? The consumers trust brands that create that authenticity. So it's going to be interesting. I think when we finally do go back to normal with sports and all of that, I think that, look, I do think sports will come back, right? I think it's if it didn't, I mean, I'd be shocked if that wasn't the case, right? I think sports in general will come back. I mean, the NBA did a really solid job doing what they did. Hopefully, this next season will be even better. It was LeBron, winning a title, after Kobe's death, and everything that sort of happened in LA, the Dodgers winning the World Series, all of these things coming together. I think people are going to have energy around it. But now what's going to be different is that people are going to judge from a different lens, right? So it's not just going to be like, hey, I'm outside Dodger Stadium and, peanuts are standing out there. What's the connection? Why should I care about peanuts, right? How are they being built, or chocolate bars, right? I mean, if you even think about the history of chocolate bars and the way that chocolate is created in Africa, right? The fact that it's so many people are sort of, you have it's one of the poorest countries, right? And they're basically, have 16-year-olds producing the cocoa, right? So even from that standpoint, right, when people start to realize all these things, they're going to be like, yeah, I'm not buying your Snickers bars or, whatever it is. Like, I think there has to be a connection. And I think that's where we're going to get to, because the next generation is so aware. I have a 16-year-old that has so much awareness for the things that I never even thought about, right? And I think that's going to start to affect the way that we connect with our brands as well. So it's going to be an interesting next couple of years, and hopefully, if we can ever have the Olympics again or the World Cups and all these things are going to happen, it's going to make for some pretty exciting times.
For sure. I definitely, I really firmly agree with that. To your point, and to Rayde's point, it's about not just your purpose driven, ethos or whatever. Or in your business strategy. It has to be the combination of both, and you just picking your lane, and that will automatically create that authenticity. Will bring that authenticity out. Something that we were discussing in previous conversations as well was the fact that there's also a trend now how consumers, especially young consumers, are being identifying even more and being more loyal to more niche brands, brands that are just operating in very small, very focused markets. And that's a trend. That's what we will see happening.
Yeah.
How these big properties now adapt to that. I think as you said, I was also very, very gladly surprised with how the NBA performed and how the NBA picked their lane and were very outspoken. They
followed it. Yeah.
They followed it. They picked their message around the social justice issues, and naturally it's I think 80% African American league. So it made sense. It made sense. It belonged.
It felt authentic.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and so if you're a consumer of that product, right, then you sort of you're feel good, or you're delighted by the fact that they went out of their way to ensure that customer experience for you was something that connected with them and their values and things like that. So I think that's what I think is going to be the future of you call it sports marketing, just the future of advertising as a whole. I think it's going in that direction, and the brands that do that better are the ones that are going to really, to me, are going to stand out, because it doesn't matter if you're Nike anymore, right? It could be like, look at the brands that come out of nowhere, like Supreme, and right, like they come out of left field. Just this little idea, and it becomes this, global brand. And so I think that's the future.
Yeah, and that's important on the data part and the understanding on the audiences that you have at your best, because that's the more you are able to identify and segment in the proper way, in the traditional, demos and things like that, is how you can offer brands a more, efficient platform for their advertising. And that's the atomization of marketing and advertising. It's going to be incredible in terms of how segmented you will be talking. And as platforms or middlemen or whatever it is, we also need to understand that the conversations that a sports league will have with fast-moving consumer goods, it's not going to be the same conversation that you, as the leader of the advertising operation in Microsoft, will have, but the underlying understanding on how they need to engage will be the same.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and it's
exactly right.
It will be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So V, you had any other question?
No, I find this whole chat very interesting, because I'm not in the sales business. I'm from the brand side. So when I try to make this, I'm the spender. So every time that I make a decision as to where do I put my money, I think about what is the whole package offering me for the money that I want to put in. Yeah. So especially for B2B, I mean, we talk about, Bing plus LinkedIn. If it's Google, you have the display, and we talk about this fight on many fronts, which for me is very interesting, because it is all about data. I talked about in previous shows a lot that I'm a big believer, if you don't make your decisions based on data, you're missing the trick.
Yeah.
And for me, that's a massive massive part of where we're going, so much so that in the future, the guys that you talk to, the guys that Rayde talks to, Luis talks to, may not have anything to do with sports and will only look at what the data is telling them.
Yeah.
They will just go, yeah, I don't care what LeBron is doing. The CTR is not right. We need to go to somebody else that gives me a better CTR. And to me, it's both exciting and scary at the same time, because you take away a little bit, you take all of the emotion out of it and you base everything on data. So it has to be a mix, but I know it's going to be quite more heavy in terms of data where we're going. That's for sure.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like this conversation can go on for hours, right? Because there's so many ways we can take it, right? Like, I mean, I'm interested in talking to you, V, on even in Munich, because that's a market that I've been working with my partner. My chief of staff actually sits out of the Munich office.
Okay. I mean, I'm quite connected with both Microsoft and LinkedIn guys in Munich, so there might be some commonalities anyway.
Yeah, all of those guys there, and so it's a market that I'm getting more and more keen on, as it progresses. So we certainly got to have maybe what we call a cocktail hour and have some other chat, maybe more
for
fluid.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I hope that this was helpful and insightful for all of you and for your viewers in terms of or listeners, as I would call it. We're podcasting now, right? But yeah, I mean, it's always interesting for me, and I enjoy these types of discussions, particularly going in so many different paths, right? And that's what I always enjoy. I mean, the unknown for me is always cool. Is not knowing where the conversation is going to end up, but it always seems to connect.
No, definitely. And I wanted to talk to you now that we are coming to an end, and for people to know, I mean, Cesar is the first person that saw the 3-paragraph scribble about what the connect might be.
Yeah,
that was a few years ago. I consider him a good, trusted friend and mentor as well. And I'm very thankful for all the advice and for you being with us here, sharing some game and some knowledge. So definitely we'll repeat that soon enough. Absolutely. And hopefully we could do a live session in New York. I mean, I'm really looking forward to going back to the city, man.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been in 10 years either. So what can I say?
Oh, wow.
And I grew up there. That's
amazing. Yeah.
That's great. Cesar,
thank you, Luis. I'm definitely, I've been to Munich, I've been to Barcelona. I know you're in Valencia now, Rayde, but I haven't been to Prague. I don't know if the lady would be so keen on me going out there to visit, but maybe there's a business trip there on the horizon.
For sure. It's a fun town. It's a fun town. Beautiful place to visit.
Yeah, for sure. I've heard.
No, Cesar, really, thank you very much for your time today with us and really enlightening us with your experience and all the things that you're doing right now.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Very rich, and I really second what Rayde said. I know he talks about you all the time, and that was one of the points that I wanted to jump into about mentorships and all these things, but we don't have enough time for it.
Yeah.
And like we said, we can talk for hours for many different
Definitely. Part 2. TBD.
For sure.
TBC.
TBC, for sure. So thank you very much, Cesar, and catch you in the next one.
You got it. Thank you, guys.
This episode is brought to you, as always, by The Connect. The Connect is Rayde Luis Baez. Follow the Intersection podcast in your favorite podcasting platform. Leave us a review and share it with a friend. This will really help us be found by more of you interested in the topics of sports marketing and deal making. Until the next one.